Have you ever believed that the world had already decided who deserves help and who must quietly endure suffering, only to realize that a single moment can shatter that belief forever? For years, there has been a quiet assumption lingering in global conversations, spoken softly but confidently, that compassion flows only from powerful nations to weaker ones. People whispered it as if it were common sense, as if the entire world had already agreed. Poor countries struggled to survive, they said. How could they possibly open their doors to others in need? That assumption carried an unspoken insult. It suggested that some nations are only receivers, never givers, that some cultures lack the capacity, the resources, or even the heart to extend help beyond their own borders. Many believed this without ever questioning it. It slipped into news headlines, academic discussions, and even humanitarian debates. And over time, it hardened into something that felt permanent. What made it more painful was that even respected voices echoed it. A well-known European policy analyst once remarked during a televised interview that crisis refugees had no realistic options outside wealthy Western countries. The statement was delivered calmly, almost kindly, as if it were simply a fact of life. No anger, no cruelty, just certainty. And millions nodded along. But what if I told you that this belief collapsed not because of a global summit or a powerful speech, but because of 22 young people who arrived quietly at an airport thousands of miles from home? They were Ukrainian students. Some were studying medicine, some engineering. Some had dreams as simple as finishing school and calling their parents with good news. Then war came. Bombs replaced lectures, sirens replaced alarm clocks. Classrooms turned into shelters. Their education was suspended, their futures placed on hold. And like so many others, they became statistics in headlines that moved too fast for anyone to truly feel. They tried to find solutions where the world told them to look. Applications were sent to universities across Europe. Emails went unanswered. Tuition fees were suddenly impossible. Some countries offered sympathy but no seats. Others offered seats but no visas. The message was polite but consistent. There is no room. By the time the idea of the Philippines appeared, it felt almost absurd. A tropical country on the other side of the world, not rich, not powerful, not usually mentioned in conversations about global rescue. Even the students themselves hesitated. Was this real help, or just another dead end? Yet, one by one, documents were processed, invitations were issued, arrangements were made quietly, without press conferences or grand announcements. And then, one ordinary day, 22 Ukrainian students landed on Philippine soil. No one expected what happened next. Not the analysts, not the critics, not even the students themselves. Because what followed did not just change their lives, it forced the world to confront a truth it had long ignored. That compassion does not belong to the wealthy alone, and that sometimes the nations the world underestimates are the ones most ready to open their hearts. At first, their stories sounded painfully similar, as if war had pressed a single mold onto 22 different lives. Nights without electricity, phones clutched in shaking hands as messages from home stopped arriving. Mothers whispering prayers through unstable connections. Fathers trying to sound strong while hiding fear. Education, once a source of pride and direction, became an unanswered question. Would any of it continue? Would any of it still matter? They tried to be practical. That was the advice everyone gave them. Be realistic. Look west. Look to the big systems that were built for moments like this. So they did. Applications were sent to institutions that appeared strong on paper. Some responses were warm but empty. We sympathize deeply. Unfortunately, we cannot assist at this time. Others never replied at all. Weeks passed. Savings dwindled. Temporary shelters felt less temporary with each passing day. One student quietly sold a family heirloom to pay for document translations. Another began working night shifts that left her exhausted and hopeless by morning. The hardest part was not hunger or cold. It was the feeling of being invisible. As if their lives were paused in a waiting room where no one planned to call their names. Friends who escaped earlier spoke of starting over, but the cost was overwhelming. Tuition fees multiplied overnight. Housing deposits demanded proof of stability no refugee could provide. Even countries that publicly declared support seemed tangled in procedures that left no room for urgency. Despair has a way of creeping in softly. It does not announce itself. It simply sits beside you and asks questions. What if this is it? What if all the years of studying were for nothing? One student admitted later that he stopped unpacking his bag wherever he stayed, convinced he would be forced to leave again within days. And then, almost quietly, something different happened. A professor forwarded an email. A church volunteer mentioned a conversation. A Filipino doctor working abroad asked a simple question that no one else had asked. What do you need to continue? Not tomorrow, not someday, now. The idea of the Philippines entered their conversations cautiously, almost apologetically. It felt too far, too unfamiliar, too unexpected. Some wondered if it was a misunderstanding. Others worried they would arrive only to be turned away. After so many closed doors, hope itself felt dangerous. Yet something about the tone was different. There were no promises of prestige, no grand speeches, just practical concern. Places to study, people willing to help. A community ready to receive strangers not as burdens, but as guests. As documents moved forward, fear mixed with disbelief. Could this really work? Could a country facing its own challenges make space for them? The question lingered in every shared message and sleepless night. And still, beneath the uncertainty, a fragile sense of anticipation began to grow. For the first time since the war began, the word tomorrow no longer sounded empty. The first thing they noticed was the air. Warm, heavy, unfamiliar, carrying the scent of rain and salt and something quietly alive. After months of cold platforms, gray shelters, and sterile offices, the Philippines felt almost unreal. For a moment, some of them wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on their senses. This was supposed to be another temporary stop, another uncertain chapter. And yet, from the moment their feet touched the ground, something felt different. They were met not by officials rushing them through procedures, but by people who looked them in the eye. Smiles that did not feel rehearsed, voices that did not sound tired of explaining policies. A simple welcome spoken with sincerity. It caught them off guard. One student later admitted that she kept waiting for the hidden condition, the moment when kindness would turn into paperwork or obligation. It never came. As days passed, the contrast became sharper. In places where they had previously been treated as cases, here they were treated as people. Professors asked about their families before asking about transcripts. Administrators apologized for small delays, as if time itself were something precious they owed these students. Even the simplest gestures felt profound. Someone remembering a name, someone offering food without asking for anything in return. Inside classrooms, the surprise deepened. Lessons were rigorous. Expectations were high. The idea that this would be an easier or lesser education disappeared quickly. Filipino lecturers spoke with passion that felt personal, as if teaching were not just a job, but a calling. One medical student sat through a lecture and realized her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from relief. She was learning again. Her future was moving forward. Outside the campus, life unfolded in ways they did not expect. Neighbors waved. Shopkeepers asked where they were from and listened to the answer. In a small chapel one evening, they sat quietly as prayers were spoken in a language they did not understand, yet somehow felt included in. No one stared. No one questioned why they were there. They were simply allowed to be present. What struck them most was that this kindness did not come from abundance. People here worked hard. Many had little, and yet generosity flowed naturally, without calculation. It challenged everything they had been conditioned to believe about help and power. They had been taught that only the strong could give. Here, they discovered that strength often looks like empathy. Slowly, skepticism gave way to trust. Fear softened into gratitude. And gratitude grew into something deeper, something harder to name. For the first time since the war began, they did not feel like survivors clinging to chance. They felt like students again, like young people allowed to dream without apology. And somewhere between a shared meal, a lecture hall filled with light, and a quiet prayer spoken by strangers, the Philippines stopped feeling like a refuge of last resort. It began to feel like a place where their broken journey might finally make sense. It happened gradually, so quietly that none of them could point to a single day when everything changed. There was no grand ceremony marking their arrival into a new life, no dramatic announcement that said, "You are safe now." Instead, transformation came through ordinary moments, the kind most people overlook until they are gone. It was in the way a classmate slid a chair closer so no one would sit alone, in the way a professor paused a lecture to ask if everyone was coping, not academically, but emotionally. It was in shared meals where laughter appeared unexpectedly, surprising even the ones who laughed. For months, joy had felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful to those left behind. Here, joy was gently invited back, not as a betrayal of pain, but as a way to survive it. Faith played a quiet but powerful role. Some of the students were religious, others were not. Yet all of them felt the calm that seemed woven into daily life. In small chapels and crowded churches, prayers were spoken not for headlines, but for strength. Strangers included them without asking questions. Candles were lit for people they had never met. In those moments, the students felt something they had not felt since the war began. They were not carrying their grief alone. What astonished them most was the resilience of the people around them. Filipinos spoke openly about hardship, about storms, poverty, uncertainty. And yet, there was laughter. There was music. There was an unshakable belief that suffering does not have the final word. One student described it simply: "They do not deny pain here. They walk through it together." As weeks turned into months, the students began to change in ways they did not expect. Shoulders once permanently tense began to relax. Conversations shifted from survival to possibility. Someone talked about specializing in medicine again. Another mentioned plans beyond next week, something that once felt impossible. The Philippines was no longer just a place that gave them shelter. It was shaping who they were becoming. Then came the moment many of them would later describe as unforgettable. A small gathering, informal and unplanned. Food shared, stories exchanged. And suddenly, one of the students began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, overcome. When asked what was wrong, she shook her head and said she had never experienced this kind of kindness without conditions. No one tried to stop her tears. They simply stayed. That night, several of them admitted something they had been afraid to say. They did not feel like temporary guests anymore. They felt seen, valued, home. For young people who had lost nearly everything, this realization was overwhelming. The Philippines had not erased their trauma, but it had given them something just as powerful: the belief that humanity, at its best, still exists. And that belief changed everything. By the time the seasons shifted and routines settled into something steady, the students began to understand that what had happened to them could not be explained as luck alone. The Philippines had not simply stepped in to fill a gap left by others. It had given them something deeper, something that does not appear on visas or academic records. It had given them back a sense of dignity. They were no longer waking each morning with the weight of uncertainty pressing on their chests. They were studying with purpose again, planning, not just reacting, calling home with stories that did not begin with fear. Parents who once whispered prayers in the dark now listened to their children speak with energy they had not heard in months. Not because the war had ended, but because hope had returned. One student said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She explained that the Philippines did not save her from suffering. It taught her how to live alongside it without losing herself. That realization felt bigger than education, bigger than safety. It felt like a lesson the world desperately needed to remember. As word quietly spread, people outside began to notice. Not because of press releases or campaigns, but because stories travel when they are real. 22 young lives, once frozen by conflict, were moving forward again. And the place that made it possible was not the one most expected. This is where the meaning expands beyond these students. In a world filled with noise, division, and exhaustion, the Philippines offered a reminder that compassion does not require perfection. It requires presence. It requires the courage to say, "You belong here," even when resources are limited and challenges are many. For Filipinos, this story carries a quiet but powerful truth. What the world sometimes overlooks is precisely what makes this nation extraordinary. Faith that does not disappear in hardship, kindness that does not wait for permission, resilience that finds joy even when circumstances are heavy. These are not small virtues. They are the foundation of real leadership in humanity. For those watching from afar, the lesson is just as clear. Greatness is not measured only by wealth or influence. Sometimes it is revealed in open doors, shared meals, and the willingness to care when others hesitate. The students know their journey is not over. Challenges remain. Healing is ongoing. But they also know something else now. When history pushed them to the edge, a country they barely knew chose to meet them with open hands. And long after degrees are earned and paths diverge, that truth will remain. In one of the darkest chapters of their lives, the Philippines stood not as a footnote, but as a turning point. A quiet testament that even in a fractured world, humanity still knows how to rise.